Welcome back. I hope you had a nice lunch. Welcome back, everybody at home. Here at the Gare Maritime, we're ready for another panel discussion. I don't know if you share this feeling, but sometimes in history, time moves faster than at other times in history. And the moment we are living now can be experienced, is experienced, I think, by many as moving too fast, too difficult, too much at once. And that lived reality and or feeling, if you like, sometimes translates in frustration, in political extremism, in particular kinds of nationalism. And the question then arises, what is the EU's answer to that? Can a European Union offer a tangible, fitting answer to worries, anxieties, realities, problems of its citizens, while at the same time upholding its ideal of unity in diversity? And more particularly in line with what we're discussing here during the New European Bauhaus Festival, what role can art, technology and architecture play in those answers, assuming those answers are out there somehow? Those are some of the questions that will be addressed by the high-level panel of this session that is going to start right now. Dr. Nicholas Maak is here again as a facilitator and moderator. You know him of the Culture and Arts supplement of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, but he's also an academic expert in architecture himself, of course. Voila, that's all from me for now. Dr. Maak, the floor is yours. Enjoy.
Thank you so much. Welcome to this panel here in the Gare Maritime in Brussels. I'm very happy to host this panel and moderate it. Also welcome to all those who watch us on screen. This is a very exciting moment for me because we have three experts here on the stage who will talk with you about the question of what architecture, technology and art could contribute in a situation that is always described as a situation of crisis, but that also holds many chances and possibilities. And I'm very happy to introduce the three of you here on stage, starting with Francesca Bria. She is the president of the Italian Innovation Fund, the board member of the Italian broadcaster RAI, and she led, which is very interesting, the Decode project on data sovereignty in Europe, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, why it's so important to talk about reclaiming data and why data is actually what is described as the fuel and the basis, economic basis of all future endeavors, including the ecological change of Europe, but also the development of a digital democracy. So very happy to have you here. You were also the founder of the City Coalition for Digital Rights, an interesting platform backed by the United Nations to promote a more, let's say, people-oriented form of digital transformation. You played an important role in that. You are a member of the high-level roundtable, as it's called, of the New European Bauhaus. And among all these things, you were also the Chief Digital Technology and Innovation Officer for the city of Barcelona. And I mention that here because it was the first time that I personally understood what all these phrases of digital transformation and ecological change and people's participation could actually mean in real policy, and how they could lead to a tangible change in the way we live in a European city. So I'm very happy to talk with you about the role of data for new forms of governance, which you experimented with in Barcelona, in a minute. But first I want to introduce the second speaker on this podium, Rem Koolhaas, who is known as an architect and founder of OMA, Architectural Office, but also as a writer and a thinker whose books from Delirious New York to SML XL influenced generations of architects and intellectuals way beyond the realm of architecture. Rem has introduced a new methodology to the field of architecture. He has often challenged discipline's dominant narratives, last time with his show called Countryside, the Future, where I also had the pleasure to be part of, where he questioned the dominant focus of architects and planners on the city as the only space where the future could happen. So he worked since 10 years on developing a whole new narrative about also the potential of non-urban spaces and what we still frame as the countryside, which of course plays a big role if we talk about the future of the planet, because like 98% of the planet's surface are non-urban environments. Some of his buildings, like the public library in Seattle, have done no less than change the course of the discipline and also our idea of what a public space could be in the future. And I think this capacity is even more needed today when, as a consequence of digitalization and especially after COVID, the way we use the city is radically changing to a point where we have to ask what we will actually do in a city when shopping malls are dying because we shop online and office towers are emptying because companies find it more profitable to encourage remote work. So most smart city concepts have no answers to that fundamental question. They propose electric and connected cars and bikes to commute to the city center, but they don't have an idea what we could do there in these city centers after the end of shopping and work as we know it. So it's very important, and I'm very happy to discuss here with two experts who have been very skeptical with the terminology of the smart city and who propose both different forms of what could be the public life of the future in the space where public life can happen in the future. And this leads me to a third expert on the panel on technology, art, and architecture. I'm very happy to introduce you to Hans Ulrich Obrist, who is a curator, a critic, an art historian, and one of the most enthusiastic persons, I would say, in the art world I know. He is a tireless explorer who makes groundbreaking exhibitions, publishes fascinating books on art, on curating, but most importantly on cultural phenomena like the extreme self, which is the title of one of his last books, a cooperation with Douglas Coupland and Shimon Bazar. Hans Ulrich invented new exhibition formats on planes, in kitchens and opera stages, spaces where you never have seen art before. In that form, he turned interviews into an own marathonic art form, and he sparked the rediscovery of thinkers like Édouard Glissant. He is also the artistic director of the Serpentine Pavilion, who just opened its temporary summer pavilion by Theaster Gates this week, so I'm very happy that you made it here. I want to start, as I announced, this discussion with a question to Francesca and talk about the Decode in Barcelona, because it really changed the way we frame town planning. And I think it was the most radical change in the way we think about designing a city and running a city. So maybe you could explain to the audience what brought you, who holds a PhD in innovation technology, to become kind of a town planner.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. And it is a great pleasure to be here. Very, very happy with this great panel. I feel we have been collaborating for years, actually, in this panel, because we have some kind of, I think, common project in the making. So let's maybe contextualize Barcelona a bit before I answer to your question. That was 5 years ago, I think, it was 2015, when the mayor of Barcelona, Ada Colau, the first female mayor, was elected. And she radically changed politics because she was coming from a citizen movement, a citizen platform, and she was elected to become the first female mayor due to large-scale citizen participation. And when she became mayor, she said, I want to propose a very social agenda, and I want to reshape the city for the people. And then she called me. I was in London at that time, working for the UK Innovation Agency, and she gave me a task that I really liked, and that's why I decided to join her. And it was, Francesca, you should come with us in Barcelona, and you should be able to explain the smart city to my mother, because I don't want it to be about technology. I want it to be about changing her life and changing the city. And I thought, yes, this is the challenge I want. And that was a time, if you remember, after it was in Spain, there was a very big citizen movement that was a bit fed up with politics at that time. I think we saw that experiment as an answer to the possible rise of populism and right-wing extremism in Europe. And the answer was not less democracy, so not more authoritarianism, but more democracy. And so I think the first thing for me, it was to show that the technology agenda has nothing to do with technology, but it should start with people, and it should give concrete answers to how we're going to change society and the city. And so we started from large-scale participation. So I think Barcelona became this experiment of participatory democracy. 400,000 citizens engaged with the policy agenda. 70% of the action plan of the city of Barcelona came directly from citizens.
And can you maybe explain how it came? Because it's very interesting to understand that this was not a bureaucratic effort, but people could react very quickly, even with their mobile phones.
So it was a hybrid between citizens' participation in the squares and in the streets, which I think then resulted in one of the most interesting urban experiments, which is now being implemented in Barcelona, which is the Superblock. That's really about radical answer to climate change, the ecological crisis, reclaiming public space and turn it into green space with a new kind of social infrastructures for people. And so there was this large-scale participation in the streets. I did 1 year of like citizen engagement, like really citizen assemblies. And then we were using technology. We brought civic hackers in the town halls, people I was collaborating with, building democratic technological tools. And we built a platform that's called Decidim Barcelona. And this is basically built with ethics, security, privacy, and democracy in mind. So it's a platform owned by the city of Barcelona. It's not owned by a big tech company. And we enable people to participate. So it's a hybrid between participatory democracy online and offline. I think when you hear about digital democracy, do not believe that's Facebook democracy. You do not solve complex problems by clicking. So it was completely against technological solutionism. And it was really trying to engage people on things that matter to them. So the problems were affordable housing, the energy transition, more green space, education, jobs. I mean, we started from that. We didn't start from technology.
And it's also important to know that you didn't start from scratch because there was already an implemented system full of problems. And one of the problems was, as in any modern city, that many facilities were in the hand of private companies. And Barcelona especially had a big problem with platforms like Uber and Airbnb. And so you did very nicely, presented it as an innovation, but it was a revolution what you did, because no other city had ever tried to tackle the power of these private companies, because many city governments say there's nothing we can do, this is how the world functions today, and you questioned that narrative and you developed a different narrative with the help of hackers and coders. And maybe you can say a word also about your heroic fight against platforms that basically destroy all benign government efforts.
Yeah, the Robin Hood, or no, the Goliath versus David versus Goliath. Yeah, no, I think, first of all, that was a very important part of communicating what's happening with data and platforms to normal people. So they weren't really, I mean, maybe in Germany, people care a bit more about information self-determination and their privacy. But all around the world, you know, if you want to explain what's the impact of tech to people, and you start with privacy, people go like, I mean, this is really not my problem, you know. And so we wanted to start with affordable housing and public transportation. And that's something, well, in Barcelona, that was like the reason why Ada Colau became the mayor. So everybody understood that the business model of Airbnb was an obstacle to extending the public housing policy, affordable housing policy. And so they started to, you know, to want to know more about how this platform works. And we had to explain, well, look, you know, it's a black box. So we can't really see what goes in and out. So we can't really inspect the algorithms. And we can't explain you why your short-term housing price is going up the roof. But it has to do with that business model. also, of course, also. And so people started engaging in a conversation about the importance of affordable public housing and public transportation system. And we then connected to the question of algorithmic transparency, the question of data, as you said, as the fuel of the digital economy. And I think the other big part of what we started to call digital sovereignty, and we didn't really mean state sovereignty, we meant popular sovereignty. I mean, we meant that citizens need to have more control over their data and more control over technology, because this has an impact on welfare, education, housing, their life in the city, and so on. And so we built things like Decode, which is a decentralized, privacy-enhancing platform built with cryptography and distributed ledger technology, blockchain. I mean, at that time, blockchain wasn't that popular. So we started coding 2012, and there were only the kind of hackers playing with these tools. Now it became a big thing, and crypto money is everywhere. But when we started this experiment, it was not very used, and definitely not by public administration.
Yeah, I think that was the big revolutionary gesture, to say we reclaim data, because data becomes almost the only economic foundation of all the good plans we have. And if we give away the data, we give away the possibility of governance. That was basically something that was discovered and discussed first in Barcelona, thanks to Francesca. As you described, this fight between the state trying to get back authority over these topics and private industry taking over more and more areas of public welfare. And I think we cannot stress enough how dramatic this situation is. In many American towns, the whole security, the welfare state questions are all run by private companies. So basically the city governments have handed over control to private companies, and it's private companies who steer the destiny of the people due to their own commercial interests. So that's why it's so important what you did, and so important that you stress the importance of regaining data. And maybe you can, just as a last, before we move over to our fellow panelists, because I think it was so telling to display the dramatic situation, is to describe what happened to your coders. Because when you told me about them, you thought these are finally European idealists who work on a better society. So what happened to them?
Yeah, nice. Yeah. Thanks for the question. And then I want to say a small thing to pass it on to Ram. And if there is anyone from the Commission in the room, I'm sure. Because we funded these coders. They were from UCL, but the UK was still fully in Europe at that point. And we funded these coders, the computer science department in UCL, with very good cryptographers for 3 years, with Horizon 2020 money, so public R&D money from the EU. And the call that we answered was data sovereignty for Europe. It was the first call that the European Commission put out. I mean, now we have it very written in the Data Governance Act and in all the digital agenda of the EU. It wasn't the case at that time. So we mobilized this team to give back sovereignty of data to citizens. And then 2 years and a half into the project, Facebook got to the team, and they took them all to Palo Alto to build Libra, their cryptocurrency. So the first rollout of Libra was built with the technology made in Europe, funded by European citizens, and the cryptographic protocol, Coconut, it was created during Decode. I just want to say a small thing to connect to Rem, that for me also the public value of data and the importance of data for democracy is also, for example, if you look at this other project in Barcelona, the Superblock, which is this planning process where we are closing entire neighborhood from cars. So they are removing cars from the city center and build new green spaces, new bicycle lanes, and new social activities for people. If there is no data to measure what you're doing, to assess the impact of your policies before you do them and after, to explain to people how the city is transforming for the better, you can't actually do those massive, large-scale projects. So this is the public value of data that we needed to fight against climate change, to make our cities greener, and for many other things.
And so basically, you see that there was a big chance, and the big chance has been stopped at some moment because Europe has nothing to offer that compares apparently to the attractiveness of the Silicon Valley for some of these coders. But of course, it's not a hopeless situation. So one of the
Working on it.
one of Europe's problems is this. Another problem of the EU has always been a lack of, let's say, tangible experience what Europe could be. And you could almost describe the EU like an oxygen. You only feel what it brings to you when it vanishes, like in the case of the Brexit, right? But when it's there, you never know what is the EU, how does it feel, what does it do for me, and how could we really turn the EU from a concept to something that can be lived. And REM has a long-standing engagement with the European Union and has developed numerous solutions and proposals. And I'm very happy to talk with you about your European involvement and also the question of what kind of typologies in new spaces we could imagine in that moment that can not only be described as a moment of crisis, but also as a moment of chance and transition. So I'm happy to hand over the screen to you.
Thank you. Can I have the first slide? Basically, we have been talking before, and I'm kind of focusing now on data and on the architecture of data, and kind of revealing, a number of projects that were kind of related to it. But I want to start with this one. This was the signing of the Treaty of Rome in '57, and basically 2 years later, in '59, the first pan-European artistic movement started. And Nicholas was talking about the EU as oxygen, and I think this is a kind of very clear demonstration of that kind of oxygen. That kind of basically artists react in 2 years after simply stimulated by this proposition. I also want to talk, I'm a convinced European, or rather an incurable European. And this is one of the reasons. This is Mitterrand and Kohl in '84. And this is in the same year, Thatcher and Reagan. And my sympathies are on the kind of previous slide and not on this slide. Because I think there's a kind of serious amount of damage that has been kind of inflicted on us by this pair. Nicholas and I have worked on an exhibition, Countryside. And in the context of the exhibition, we encountered all kinds of issues, of course. One of the important issues, maybe most suggestive issues, is that we feel that it's crucial that Europe kind of establishes very creative kind of connections and very deliberate connections and very eager connections with Africa, because that is kind of for the time being probably a very important part of what Europe could be and what Africa could be, maybe even a hybrid between the two. But I want to talk about data. This is a virgin area in Nevada, and it is being sold to huge companies. And basically those huge companies are placing in this incredibly beautiful landscape larger and larger entities, and the companies are, of course, Facebook, Google, Amazon, and in this particular case, Tesla with Battery Factory. What is amazing is that in terms of architecture, these are completely inert, abstract boxes that don't reveal what is going on in them, even though the process is very kind of sophisticated. And in terms of architecture, they're also revolutionary because they're fundamentally hostile to human entry. This is one of the things, and they're kind of incredibly kind of guarded by military guards that in many cases actually carry kind of weapons. And of course, that kind of hostility has never previously existed in architecture. But the irony is that kind of in terms of visual effects, they're unbelievably beautiful spaces. And beautiful spaces because they're dedicated to new abstract processes, and they don't have to deal with all the kind of inheritance of humanism that architecture has been carrying for kind of very long time. So basically for that reason I've been intrigued by them, kind of thinking about how could we kind of make them kind of slightly more interesting, maybe by stacking them, maybe by kind of adding some kind of monuments to them. And this is maybe the most crucial things we could do, making them public and making them inviting, making them kind of relate to the outside world, and basically making them accessible and making them kind of part of daily life. In retrospect, one project that I did in 89, as part of when the wall fell, as part of a kind of potentially new Europe, was a very big library in Paris. And I'm still proud of the definition of that project because I interpreted the library as a solid block of information. And in that sense, I would say it was a kind of prototype of a data center even before that word was coined. And so you can consider this as a kind of European data kind of center. And you could kind of basically imagine that instead of books, libraries, kind of movies, this would be a place where any European could kind of interact with the data that have been accumulated for them, about them, and any other kind of relevant interaction. And so we've been kind of looking, and this is where the kind of border between architecture as a real thing or architecture as a kind of virtual thing is, of course, diffuse. This could be, you could imagine that the European data center could be inserted, for instance, in a kind of temple near Naples, a Greek temple. The Greeks kind of basically put it there, you know, almost in the middle of nowhere as a kind of assertion of Greek values. You could imagine kind of more or less the same thing kind of happening now, assertion of kind of European values. Or, and this is a kind of building that still exists in Rome, the Roman Senate, where so many important, crucial decisions were taken. Maybe that could be kind of also kind of turned into a kind of data center or a place where you interact with data in the Roman Forum itself. Or, and this is one of the kind of holiest places, of course, of modern architecture, Mises Museum in kind of Berlin, an empty box which could be a data center, but which in a kind of more intelligent way, you could also imagine that a data center doesn't need necessarily to be only about data. It could also be about art, or art can also be interpreted as data, so that you create kind of new combinations of old worlds. So that is kind of basically a number of speculations about this issue of how can data be made public.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think this is also a crucial moment because clearly data centers are the biggest buildings of our time, bigger than skyscrapers, just horizontal and almost invisible. But while being invisible with a reason, the content influences our lives more than anything else. So I think it's, when we talk about the question, what could be a public space of the future, it's very important to think about this moment. And as in the 70s, the Centre Pompidou was a reaction to an endeavor to bring culture and education to the whole population, not reduce it to an elitist group who has access to it. It's the same urgency today to make people understand what data could do for them, how they could use their data. And I think it's always dangerous to claim that everything is in the metaverse and in virtual space, and it would be nostalgic to insist on sitting together in a physical space. I think the opposite is true. If you have a building like that in the center of a city that makes also visibly digital life part of your daily life, then people will finally understand that pressing the accept all button is not a solution to stay sovereign and to not become a digital colony of private companies or the Silicon Valley. So I think it's a very important, if we talk about public space, it's important to understand that public space could mean something else in and with a building like this. And of course, I think that is one of the crucial questions we have to ask here when we talk about the new European Bauhaus. The question also at the original Bauhaus was what could actually be public life beyond the forms of public life we know. And you see all the disappointing architectures where you create a piazza that looks like a Roman piazza and one cafe and social housing around, and it looks very dead in the end. Everybody says, okay, this is not a solution. And it's also not a solution because no one thought about what people actually do, how they spend their day, how they want to live together, how they want to combine work and life. And of course, the combination of how we work and how we live is an ecological topic. And you can, I think, avoid a lot of car traffic, of commuting if you build intelligent architectures. But you also have to ask axiomatic question of what are people actually doing? And then one answer is gaming. And everybody who hears gaming thinks, oh no, the youth is lost, they vanish in their games, they should go out and play football. And then you have all this like conservatism turned against the idea of gaming. And so I was very happy and intrigued when I saw Hans Ulrich's show in Düsseldorf on gaming, because walking through it and walking and seeing the reaction of artists to the world of gaming, you could understand that gaming can be much more than an endangered young person retiring in his room and doing violent things online. So I'm very happy to have you reflect upon what could be a new form of public life that is involved and deals with gaming, and that could, of course, be integrated in that planned idea of a public server farm that is not only a reservoir and a display of the biggest treasure we have in our time, but also a platform for a new form of public life. So, Hans Ulrich, maybe you might say a word about it.
Yeah, thank you, Niklas, and thank you, Francesca and Rem. It's so exciting to be here with all of you. And yeah, it's indeed, I think, directly connected to what both Rem and Francesca said. It's a question of data, how that also connects to art. I had a conversation recently at DLD in Munich with Maria Gabriel, connected actually to the New European Bauhaus, where she talked about the idea of a bridge, bridging the world of art, science, technology. And that's, of course, very much what's happening now with the younger generation of artists working with gaming. I think the key question, looking at Rem's amazing presentation, I'm kind of thinking, it's, of course, also the question of a new institution. And I think the question is, can we network, what Ben Vickers always says, can we network an existing institution? That's something we try to do at the Serpentine, the artistic director of the Serpentine, and we try to network this institution with a lot of digital projects. And that, of course, means that we go away from a restrictive kind of binary of physical and digital, that it's a kind of a holistic approach. The physical gallery is no longer the only host, but it's a kind of a node, or it's an aspect of a larger web. And I mean, recently we did an exhibition on gaming, and this exhibition had 140 million visitors online. And many, many million people who have never been to a museum all of a sudden came to the physical space. But then, of course, it also raises the issue, thinking about Rem's idea of a data center as an institution, the European institution, of a new institution. And there, of course, we have an amazing model with John Littlewood and Cedric Price of the Fun Palace. They worked with cybernetics, and they thought about a new institution from scratch. You could choose, actually, in that sense, there, as communities to come together and bring art and science together. And the question is always, do we build a new institution? And probably the question is both. We have to network existing institutions and build new institutions. Now, in 2021, 2.8 billion people, that's a third of the world population, played video games. So that means that a niche pastime has become the biggest mass phenomenon of our time. Many people spend hours every day in this parallel world, and in a way, video games are to the 21st century what maybe movies are to the 20th and novels to the 19th century. Now, it's interesting that traditionally, video games were created by a small and very insular group of people coming from the world of engineering with a very limited perspective. And this is now changing because of the access many people have to game engine, to the tools. So artists actually are increasingly able to invent their own games. And Anna Antropy anticipated that already 10 years ago, but it's now becoming a reality. When in Rise of the Video Game Dynasties, she wrote, "What I want from video games is a plurality of voices. I want games to come from a wider set of experiences and present a wider range of perspectives. I can imagine, and you are all invited to imagine with me, a world in which digital games are not manufactured for the same small audience, but one in which games are authored by you and me for the benefit of our peers." And that, of course, means that in a very important way, we have a sort of a polyphony or an archipelago of game. We don't have a sort of a monopoly. It goes very much back also to what Francesca was talking about, the idea of basically giving games back to the people. most of these artist games we are showing are actually open source. Artists resisting the commercialization in terms of the internet. And of course, many of them are multiplayer games. And that leads to the kind of second part I wanted to talk about here. Niklas asked me to talk a little bit about Édouard Glissant. I think that Édouard Glissant is in many ways the most important thinker and philosopher. Here is another game, actually connected also to the environment and to ecology, which is also, of course, an important aspect of many of these games. The Institute for Queer Ecology also connecting it also to utopia. And Édouard Glissant, we have here Julie Meritus homage to him, and actually different artists homage to him, talked about the archipelago. He's a philosopher from Martinique, who lived in Paris big parts of his life, and he was always saying that the archipelago is extremely important because it was there that actually the idea of creolization, the blend of cultures, was most brilliantly fulfilled. He says the continents reject mixings. And I was thinking, listening to both of your presentations, in a way, monopolies of data are kind of continents. They are continental, homogenizing, often also in that sense oppressive entities. And so the Glissantian idea of an archipelago is super interesting in relation also to data, because in a way the archipelagic thought, Glissant makes it possible to say that actually neither each person's identity nor the collective identity are fixed and established once and for all. So in a way I can change through the exchange with the other without losing or diluting my sense of self. And that's kind of what archipelagic thought can teach us. And that's, of course, makes it very relevant beyond data, just for the world and for the 21st century, because we live, of course, in a world of globalization where homogenized forces of globalization lead to extinction and lead to an ecological disaster and lead to the extinction also of many cultural phenomena. But at the same time, and Glissant was the philosopher who actually anticipated that since the 70s, that not only do we have this danger, but we also have the counter-reaction. We have the counter-reaction of a new form of localism, of a new form of nationalism, of a new form of lack of tolerance. And he said we need to resist both and actually find a form of mondialité. No? So out of this archipelago, he wanted to develop a mondialité, a tourbillon, a sort of a whirlpool of the all world. And that, of course, raises also the issue in a very interesting way about the local, which I think is super urgent in all these conversations. And we discussed this actually with Mantia Diawara, the filmmaker, who is also, was very close to the late Édouard Glissant. And thinking about this idea of the local brings us to the idea of being rooted in one's country, in one's continent, in one's culture, as something being very important. But it is only important as long as it actually doesn't lead to the exclusion or annihilation of other people's roots. It's only important as long as it doesn't lead to the hierarchization or election, actually, of some roots over others. So as Glissant said, we need to celebrate roots that expand elsewhere, roots actually that touch each other, so roots which are not singular roots, but roots that cover and protect some others. I think the other thing which makes Glissant very interesting, and that's the last point, is actually utopia, and the relationship he kind of defined to utopia, because in a way, Glissant was very critical of the classical utopias, such as Plato's Republic or Thomas More's Utopia, because he considered those to be static systems. So he wrote a very beautiful novel, which I always recommend, called Sartorius from 1999, where he describes the Batutu people deriving identity not at all from genealogy, but actually solely from being constantly in exchange with each other. So for him, utopia was not something static, but utopia is kind of, as you can see here, it's the tourbillon of the all world. And I think it's interesting if you think about an institution for the 21st century, and I think it's interesting also in relation to the New European Bauhaus, that it's a kind of an all-world institute, the idea of the Institut du Monde. And then when I asked him about what is this utopia, which is not static, he said it must be said that actually it's a trembling utopia. And trembling is not uncertainty, it's not fear. Trembling is the instinctive feeling that we need to reject all categories of fixed thought and imperial thought. The old world trembles. The old world trembles physically, geologically, mentally, spiritually, because the old world is actually, and now comes the synthesis in a way, because he says the old world is looking for the point, the utopian point, where all the world's cultures, all the world's imaginations can meet and hear one another without dispersing or losing themselves. And I think that's a kind of a very beautiful definition what an institution for the 21st century, and in that sense, no European Bauhaus could eventually be.
Yeah. I'm very grateful for this introduction of Édouard Glissant. I'm trying to connect the dots because you heard a fantastic project for a server farm, an introduction into the thinking of Glissant, and I think there is a beautiful way to connect both of them in the idea of the archipelago. Because when we talk about institutions, about Europe, decentralization has been always a very important idea, not to concentrate power in one place, but to create a network of 27 countries and many regions and areas. And so if we take the archipelago idea and connect it to the technical development, of course the archipelago could become a mode of thinking to counteract the concentration of power in like 5 companies in the Silicon Valley who are worth more than the entire European stock market together. So could basically, and this is a question to Francesca, who is the technological expert here on the panel, could the archipelago of data distribution be a way out of Europe's very uncomfortable situation of basically being a digital colony of big companies? So could also the distribution of, let's say, server farms in local areas, in villages, in borghi, be decentralized data, be a way out of the dependency that we have today from being steered by big companies through access to data? So is the data archipelago a solution for Europe?
I mean, now I would bring in also Stefano Boeri that was here yesterday, because all the time we talk about smart cities, he goes like, this is going to be an archipelago of connected, countrysides and small borghi and cities, and we have to rethink the geographical aspect of what we're building. But let me first, because I wanted to connect the dots in a different way with the question of utopia. And because, I mean, what we are discussing, not to look at too naive here, it's a big political utopia. And it's a political utopia that I think must be practiced in a way. So I like this idea looking at the European Bauhaus as these laboratories, connected, distributed laboratories of experimentation of this kind of utopia. And we had a conversation together with our friend Bernard Stiegler about reterritorialization of technology, but I do think is a political project. So I think a lot of my life has been about explaining how technology is political, because in a sense you have to rethink. Nowadays is very easy to understand it because we are in the middle of a geopolitical crisis, of a geopolitical redefinition of where we're at in the world. And when we think about supply chains, disruption, when we think about dependency from raw materials, I mean, now we have, of course, a geopolitically induced energy price shock. But this is going together with a crisis in terms of food, raw materials. So when we speak about technology today and having the conversation in the policy space, we talk about we miss lithium. We need access to neon. We need microchips. I mean, the big act, the big European policy at the moment is the Microchip Act, because Europe needs to produce microchips and design microchips here, because also the dependency with our key industries, starting from the automobile sector, which needs, of course, to change. It's dependent on this access of raw material and rare earth, and we know how this is a geopolitical question. So you basically have to relate back technology with what's happening in the world, but also with a much more, let's say, less naive, that's connected to the idea of another globalization or rethinking globalization. I think we are at a point thinking about what we need to reshore, what we can produce locally, how we rethink about value chains and supply chains that is really a redesigning of globalization. So I think in this sense, I'd like also to connect the server farm with decision-making, of course, meaning with democracy itself, because I think what we're saying here is that if you imagine a data farm connected to the town hall, is because we want to bring this topic back to the polis, back to society, back to where they belong. So they cannot be left out there in the data centers owned by few giant companies that are not accountable to the public. Those are topics that need a societal conversation that has to be democratic. At least in Europe, we can strongly say so. And it is a little bit about decision-making, but it is also about, that's my utopia, that I always talk about, okay, what's the vision for the digital world in the future? And we are confronted with two models, right? The big tech from Silicon Valley, and the big state from China, because also we have a digital authoritarianism in the making. I mean, that's not only, maybe you would say don't be dismissive with that, because actually we have to respect different cultures and so on. But the model is big state on one side and big tech on the other side. And I'm always saying we need a space beyond big tech and big state, and this is going to be big democracy, and it needs to be practiced in Europe. And this is utopic because, there are a lot of obstacles to make this agenda real. And I think what we're discussing here is where to start. And let's bring back the question of ecology that you hinted at, because obviously in the, for example, Next Generation EU plan, there is a reason why the Commission has been linking the digital transition with the ecological transition and the energy transition, because they're part of the same conversation, rethinking our development model, having a conversation in a new geopolitical dimension. And when we transition to a different energy source and to a different ecological model, at the core of it, it's going to be our capacity to use technology differently, right? So I think we basically are at a point that we need more of those kind of experimentations. So my point is we're going to get here only, and that's why I like cities, because cities can be a place where those experiments happen.
And also the countryside can be maybe a space where this can happen. Maybe we can talk, Rem, briefly about this idea of the archipelago and the distribution also of technology, because Europe, of course, has a chance to reactivate certain areas that are emptying, like in East Germany, in southern Italy. And the question is, and I think that was also part of the research of the Countryside project, was how could you re-engage with the countryside, not only see it as a reservoir, but also as a space where these new forms of life can happen under certain conditions, like bringing technology to the countryside, combining even maybe a borgo with a small-scale server farm that is connected to other server farms, because there, of course, are different scales we can discuss. So what is your feeling? Is the city the only field of experimentation, or can we expect?
Well, no, obviously not. I think that we were... The Countryside exhibition kind of opened in the Guggenheim in the winter, in January, February 2020. The interesting thing is that we then, as a kind of model, or as an underlying question, we're asking how can we avoid that the countryside empties and that everyone moves to the city. Now it's 3 years later, only 3 years later, and in a way the question is reversed. How can we kind of avoid that the countryside is kind of being invaded by all the other activities? And for me, that is a kind of very, very interesting situation. Because 3 years ago, we were assuming that in the end, or very soon, the current 50-50 percentage between countryside and city would maybe in 20 years turn into a kind of 20-80 situation. I'm 100% convinced that that will never happen. And that maybe, if we're lucky, we're kind of already in a kind of different situation where the countryside is gaining kind of rather than losing. And that implies immediately that the countryside needs to be taken seriously as a kind of viable way, a viable place to work, and particularly a viable place to think, because that is the irony that we simply don't think that. And of course, in the past, in Otium, every Roman didn't think in the city, but they thought on the countryside. And I think there are interesting prototypes like Sophia Antipolis, where there are very intelligent prototypes of a kind of settlement dedicated to research in idyllic situations and with very intellectual outcomes.
Yeah. So Sophia Antipolis, for those who don't know, was in France kind of a forerunner of a Silicon Valley concept to concentrate tech companies, future-oriented companies, and what we call startups today in a beautiful setting in the countryside near the Mediterranean Sea. And that was basically maybe a good way to also attract intelligent people into Europe, and maybe the European Union should also think about re-engaging with these concepts of an attractive space where mostly young inventors can go and stay in Europe. What you mentioned, Ram, was also bringing me to the question whether this whole narrative about the city being the only space of future endeavors is a very European, very Western, very Northern narrative. Because if you go to many countries in Africa, there is a very leapfrog development of the countryside into a territory of digital experimentation, much better partly than in Europe. And this brings me to another question, because it was mentioned at the start of this conversation that digitalization and globalization created among many people in Europe kind of a frustration that leads to nationalism and campanilismo, and that we in a way have to save the idea of Europe. On the other hand, it's, I think, quite problematic to concentrate a discourse on the future in times of globalization, of global climate crisis, on the political boundaries of Europe. And also to talk about data spaces, it would make, if I understand you rightly, Francesca, it would make much more sense to create a common data space of Europe and Africa, which of course is a utopia, but also maybe a necessity and something that urgently has to be fostered and developed. Because if we, as you frame it, have to do with big state and big tech as two opponents, then a data space between Europe and Africa could become a very powerful tool, acknowledging the very problematic and violent history of Europe and Africa, where I think Europe has to be very convincing that this time this will be a different form of cooperation than in the past. But I think, is that a necessity to take the discourse and data that we started with the server farm as a starting point, also to expand in a very Glissantian way, Hans Ulrich, to a more mundane, in the sense of Glissant, mundane way of framing also Europe, but not only Europe's future, departing from Europe?
I think there's, in the beginning of Europe, kind of very beautiful concept that there is a number of rules, and anyone who supports those rules can be part of it. And in a kind of certain way, it's totally independent of geography. And I think that if we continue to behave like that, it's not only Africa, but maybe also, if we're lucky, South America, and basically any one party who doesn't want to kind of belong to any one of the imminent blocks can be part of it. That would be wonderful and also generous.
A mega archipelago in a way.
A mega archipelago. No?
Francesca, what is your thought about Hans Ulrich?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking, we are here in Brussels, and the first time I came to Brussels, when I was still a student, I actually met Ilya Prigozhin here, the late Ilya Prigozhin, and he basically wrote an extraordinary book together with the incredible Belgian philosopher Isabelle Stengers. And it was an amazing book, I think very relevant for all the discussions on the New European Bauhaus, all the conversations we are having, and just this point we are discussing now, because it's a book really between a scientist and a philosopher, and it's a book about new alliances. And I think this idea of new alliances, it's very important to think that micro and macro. and the conversation just went into macro, and I think that's what Rem says is a huge potential of such new, more macroscopic alliances. But I think we should never forget to also think them every day more microscopically. And that's, of course, our friend Bernard Stiegler, whom you, Francesca, quoted before, the late Bernard Stiegler. That's what he also was saying. He was basically saying that we need to go into all kinds of communities and need to basically connect them and make unexpected alliances between them, people who otherwise wouldn't talk to each other, and that we can only solve the problems of the 21st century if we do that. And it's kind of interesting that that also connects to an old idea, actually, of the 60s of the art displacement group, which was this idea that every corporation, every company, every governmental structure would have an artist in the wider sense, a poet, a visual artist, an architect, a designer, either in residence or on the board. And I think the time has come for this idea. It kind of was an utopia in the 60s, 70s, but I think now that, particularly given the climate crisis, we all need to pivot. Nobody's better at pivoting than artists. So I think, it's a plaidoyer for making that a concrete utopia.
Francesca, I would love to ask you one of the last questions, because we're approaching the end of this discussion, linking the micro and the mega scale. Because I think in your work you did that too. So it was about encouraging and empowering people to use their physical surroundings in a different way and to be enabled to do that. At the same time, we understood also, again, in this conversation, that data is the key to digital sovereignty, to economic sovereignty.
Changes right now, and those changes obviously need to have a conversation with the global south. I mean, needs to be, we can't do it ourselves, but then the polluters are the 1% that concentrate all the wealth. I mean, this is a fact. So I think we have to deal with this huge problem. And this huge problem has to deal with, it has to confront with the thing that we need to redesign capitalism today and globalization today. And of course, yes, localism and bring it back to the daily life and to where you live. It's a good way to empower people, I think, because I think why Ursula von der Leyen had the urgency of making the new European Bauhaus the soul of the Green Deal. I think because she understood, she has great leadership in understanding that you need a grassroots movement to make it happen. It has to come from below and from the people. It cannot just be a climate law. Of course, we need good laws, and this is what we're fighting now in the European Parliament. And we need, and we need to make it balanced from a societal and make it societal sustainability at the core of it, because otherwise people are not going to participate. But at the same time, this will involve a conversation that's broader than the local and needs to have this kind of institutions of the 21st century that have a new mindset about where we're going. So I always say digitization, we can't just accelerate it. It needs a direction. And this direction, I think it's social and environmental sustainability and maybe a different idea of where Europe is in the world today.
Okay, thank you so much. I think that was a beautiful way to end. And we heard, other than in many other things I had to moderate in other places where you leave the panel a bit disappointed. You say sustainable, green, you never understand what it could be. In this case, it was different. We have a very precise idea how a new space for interaction and social life could look like, and how it is connected to a broader concept of a mega archipelago of digital sovereignty and what Europe's role could be in that. So we have a real outcome. I am very grateful for that, a very efficient conversation. I could go on for hours, but we only have 5 seconds left. So.
Niklas, if you have 5 seconds, maybe have, because I had one slide where everybody would be invited to dial a telephone number and speak to the late Édouard Glissant. So if you could have that exactly. So that was for the show at Luma in Arles with Édouard Glissant. If you dial this number, you will have Édouard Glissant with you.
Wonderful. So call Édouard Glissant. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being on the screen with us. And I hope I see you all very soon here on the stage again and in the audience. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Really good. Really good. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen, lady, and Niklas Maak, for this stimulating conversation. Indeed, very, very, very interesting. We say goodbye to the online audience for a while only. Be back at 2:30, please, for the next panel session. For you here, do not go anywhere because we've got a next guest lined up for you. See you in a while.